This goes back to being in that observing mind. I was someone for 44 years stuck in that default mode where life was a constant up and down, reacting, wanting this, disliking this. When I finally sat down and said, I have to discover this inner peace somehow, the process that took me 6 months was spending more time in that observing mind, which you can do with mindfulness practice or prayer, is you spend more time in that central executive. When you start to meditate, it may be difficult. You may only get fleeting glimpses of being fully present, but for a few seconds, you may notice the gap between your thoughts, and you realize that is a very peaceful place. Eckhart Tolle has talked about this. When you're the observer, when you're present, that's the brain's natural resting state. It is a place of calm. When you build that observing mind, you spend more time in it. When the default mode network comes on, you recognize it. And you say, oh, hi, default mode. You watch the thoughts come and you watch the thoughts go. It doesn't control you. Those thoughts don't take over as much. So now, a couple of years into this, I recognize when my default mode is coming on. I see it and I thank it. I observe it and I thank it for what it's doing. Whereas several years ago, it was just a roller coaster, constantly up and down with all the thoughts.
I'm thrilled to introduce my guest today, Dr. Hosein, who brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this conversation. As a physician, scientist, and cancer drug developer in the biotech sector, he's dedicated over 2 decades to studying and developing new medicines for cancer patients. He earned both his MD and PhD from the University of California, San Francisco, and has made significant contributions to the field, co-authoring more than 20 scientific publications and patents in cell and cancer biology. What I found that truly sets Dr. Hosein apart is his groundbreaking work on the default mode network, or DMN. This network, which encodes our human ego and influences our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, is the subject of his book, Breakthrough: Master Your Default Mode and Thrive. In his work, he helps readers understand and master their DMN to lead happier and more fulfilling lives. Hossein's approach is interdisciplinary. He draws out his deep understanding of medical science, neuroscience, also incorporating insights from Buddhism, Judeo-Christian teachings, and ancient philosophy. His unique perspective allows him to bridge the gap between medical and spiritual realms, offering readers a path to unlock their health, well-being, and higher selves. Hosein, welcome to the Transcendent Minds podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Peter. I'm delighted to talk to you about this very important topic. And thank you so much for all you're doing and your show. I really appreciate your work.
You're most welcome. I read through your book, and part of what I'm seeing is you're pushing the boundaries of our understanding of the human mind and its potential. You present a profound juxtaposition between the advancements in human medicine and the rising rates of mental and spiritual distress. While we've made significant strides in treating physical diseases, there remains a deep void in addressing the root causes of emotional and psychological suffering. The whole concept of the default mode network is a breakthrough in understanding the human ego and its role in generating the mental states that lead to suffering. And as I understand it, the DMN is active when the mind is not focused on external tasks and gives rise to what you describe as mental knots. States like stress, anxiety, and addiction keep individuals trapped in cycles of distress. By unraveling these mental knots, a state of inner peace, and awaken their higher selves, leading to a more fulfilling and serene life. Now, you also draw on a variety of traditions in the book, including medicine, psychology, and spirituality, to propose a holistic approach where the physical and spiritual are intertwined. You mentioned the remarkable advancements in treating physical diseases, yet there's an increase in mental and spiritual distress. Could it be that the same scientific approach used in physical medicine might not be adequate for addressing psychological and spiritual
Yes.
well-being.
Until now, that has been the case. Until now, these factions really have been in disagreement. I'm talking, of course, about science and spirituality, medicine and psychology, psychotherapy. They haven't really communicated with each other, but that's changing. We're living in an amazing time where science and medicine are finally coming together with the mental health, with the spirituality, because we are now understanding the brain. A lot of these terms about the higher self and the ego, until now, they've been really mysterious terms. And folks who've been rooted in science have just dismissed it as, well, this is not really science. What are you actually talking about? That's all changing. Let me start with a very simple question. Have you noticed that during the day, your mind wanders or wavers back and forth between being present here in the now and then wandering off either to the past or future? Have you noticed that? Of course you have.
Absolutely.
So why does the brain do that? Why is it that we are present for some portion of the day and for the rest of the day, we're somewhere else? Why does the brain switch back and forth? And why is it that some people are stuck in that wandering state? This all now gets to the science, the neuroscience. So it turns out that our brain, the neocortex, which is the part of the brain that makes us human, that's really different from other animals, we're finally starting to really understand it. The brain has 90 billion neurons. Until now, we haven't really understood how these neurons are connecting to give rise to each one of us. So it turns out the brain has networks. That's how the brain functions. There's different parts of the brain. They connect, they do a function for you. Groups of neurons are working together to perform these amazing functions, forming memories and paying attention. We have at least, as we're understanding now, and the science is still evolving, we have at least 7 of these networks. One of them you're very familiar with, the visual network, helps you see. Sensory motor network helps you move and sense. And then you get to these 3 very critical networks that explain the brain and our behaviors, the higher self, spirituality. It all takes place in these 3 networks. So I'll walk through them. The first one, the topic of this book, default mode network. That's when your brain wanders off. When your brain wanders off, takes you away from the present, like you're watching a movie, and suddenly you're reminded about something that happened yesterday. It takes you away from the movie. That's your default mode network that has just switched on. A set of connections has taken over. You're no longer in the present. That's the default mode network. Then you have central executive network. That's your brain that is present, here and now, in the present moment, immersed with your senses, and the mental chatter is off. That's your observing mind, central executive network. Then you get to this third one called Salience Network, which is responsible for shuttling you back and forth between default mode, wandering mind, central executive, observing mind. We're still understanding why the Salience Network makes a decision, it's time to switch over to default mode, or it's time to be present. How does it make that decision? We're starting to understand all of that, and it's shedding light on our mental health and how to break through to this higher self that has been so elusive. That's the topic of this book. As you mentioned, this is not a scientific textbook. This is not an academic book. It is a spiritual, self-help, personal growth book to have you really come to get to know and understand your default mode.
Many people are on remote where they get triggered into reactivity based on a historical mechanism that is unconscious. What you're giving them is a manual as distinct from being on remote. The default mode network described as the source of the ego and mental knots. How does this network interact with other parts of the brain? And why is it specifically linked to these negative states that you outlined in the book?
Yes. What is the purpose of the default mode network? That we evolved the default mode network many thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago when we lived in difficult circumstances in jungles and cave and life was very hard. The default mode network evolved to ensure our survival. So we have 100 things that happened to us yesterday. We focus on the most negative. The default mode network has a tendency to focus on those negative, most painful experiences. Why? To ensure our survival. It will look ahead to the future and can think about the worst possible scenario. Why? To ensure our survival. But in doing so, it gives rise to anxiety, depression, and negativity. In our teenage years, this default mode network starts to develop and forms the basis of our identity. When it goes back into the past, it is building that storyline of me and I. Just take a look and notice when your mind wanders throughout the day, what types of thoughts come up. Observe it subjectively, and you'll notice it's a very self-centered network. It's all about me and I. We don't wander off and think about climate change. We don't wander off and think about how is the school for all the other kids. We think about me and I. The default mode network is the ego. And when it wanders off, it is building that storyline, trying to ensure our survival, but in doing so, gives rise to these knots that can prevent us from being truly happy and at peace. So we can delve more deeply into it. But again, I wouldn't get angry at the default mode. I wouldn't get upset when it shows up. We all have it. We do need it for proper functioning, but it is possible to understand it and to heal it so that this default mode network starts to work for us and not against us. That's the whole point.
In my mentoring practice, they're walking around with a ball of string with knots in it, and they attempt to untie or unravel one knot, but they find another knot. They attempt to unravel that knot, and there's another knot, and those physical knots or mental knots. And I noticed in the book, you draw parallels between the physical knots in the body and the mental knots in the mind. How do you envision the process of untying these mental knots? Are there any specific techniques or practices you'd recommend?
Yes. First of all, the knots, and I call them knots, I don't call them syndromes or diseases, because in the old days, we gave somebody a diagnosis and said, here's your condition, ADHD, live with it. Here's some medication that won't really get at the root cause. And that was that. It's not very fair for people because these are reversible. Each of these can be addressed at its source, and the source is the brain. The source of all of our suffering is in the brain. You're absolutely correct that you resolve one knot and something else shows up. For example, you resolve an addiction, but there's another knot, emotional pain, that you haven't addressed. So these knots, I present them in a particular order. I found that when you first start with stress, which is front and center, the first knot, once you get your stress under control and learn how to prevent your stress from escalating, all the other knots become a lot easier to heal. Starting with stress, front and center, we can talk about it. And then once you can resolve some of that, then it's emotional pain, which is front and center for many of us from childhood, ancestral pain that we've never really resolved, that we instead medicate or avoid. And that often gives rise to the third knot, which is addiction. Many of us pursue pleasure and craving as a way of coping with our emotional pain rather than resolving it. And we can get to the other knots. But what I've integrated in this book are, you mentioned, spiritual techniques, medical techniques, psychology, Buddhist techniques around mindfulness, and very simple exercises, focus exercises, breathing exercises that are designed to quiet that default mode network. I've put them all in one place because we are all very different, and some may gravitate towards the spiritual practices, others may not, and that's fine. But all the tools are here for you to figure out what works best for you.
In terms of the importance of self-understanding in the healing process, how does one begin the journey of understanding the root causes of their mental knots? Is this something that can be achieved independently, or does it require guidance?
You can do it yourself. I actually did it myself. It took me about 6 months. Others are different. Others will need a therapist, and that's fine. Those techniques are also in the book. But for me, it was the technique of insight meditation. Vipassana was critical for me. That's highlighted here. What it really comes down to is coming to understand the default mode network, your wandering mind, coming to understand when your mind wanders away, what happens. And we think we are our thoughts. And the default mode network tends to be very reactive, judgmental, negative. When you come to recognize that this default mode wanders off, that's not the real you. The real you is the observer. That's been said over many generations. You are the observer. It has a name, the central executive. When you come to understand that being in that central executive, that's who you actually are, and you spend more time in it, that is the journey of self-discovery that Buddha talked about, Jesus talked about, a lot of the prophets talked about. It now has a name, and the whole process is more objective, a little more scientific because we now understand the brain. We're just lucky to be alive now. And it's just the beginning where the science is leading the way, finally.
There's also a suggestion that by breaking through internal knots, through mental knots, one can achieve a state of inner peace and harmony, which I would take a guess that's much more parasympathetic dominance. How do you reconcile this with the common experience that life's external challenges often reintroduce stress and anxiety?
Yes. So this goes back to being in that observing mind. I was someone for 44 years stuck in that default mode where life was a constant up and down, reacting, wanting this, disliking this. When I finally sat down and said, I have to discover this inner peace somehow, the process that took me 6 months was spending more time in that observing mind, which you can do with mindfulness practice or prayer, is you spend more time in that central executive. When you start to meditate, it may be difficult. You may only get fleeting glimpses of being fully present, but for a few seconds, you may notice the gap between your thoughts, and you realize that is a very peaceful place. Eckhart Tolle has talked about this. When you're the observer, when you're present, that's the brain's natural resting state. It is a place of calm. When you build that observing mind, you spend more time in it. When the default mode network comes on, you recognize it and you say, oh, hi, default mode. You watch the thoughts come and you watch the thoughts go. It doesn't control you. Those thoughts don't take over as much. So now, a couple of years into this, I recognize when my default mode is coming on. I see it and I thank it. I almost observe it and I thank it for what it's doing. Whereas several years ago, it was just a roller coaster, constantly up and down with all the thoughts. So it is possible to break free from that. It's what Cartels of the world are saying. But again, now for a lot of people, they need that scientific objectivity, which is what the neuroscience now is helping us. This is all tangible. It's a more objective framework now.
You have to engender what I call the compassionate witness or the observer. References in the book of spiritual teachings alongside modern neuroscience. In what ways do you see these traditions complementing each other? And are there potential conflicts between them in the context of mental health?
There's definitely conflicts between them in the context of politics. Which I'm not here to talk about the politics of religion, but rather those core values. And it turns out whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, there are some core values at the heart of all of these. And a lot of these core values challenge that default mode network. Things like equanimity, right? Equanimity, you see it in all the religions. It's a core value of Buddhist practice. What equanimity is basically being at ease with unease. Your default mode network wants to focus on the negative. With equanimity, you observe the good and the bad of life equally. You're challenging that default mode network. Forgiveness, at the heart of many religions. Forgiveness challenges the default mode network wants to blame, feel guilt and blame, and hold on to emotional pain. That's what it wants to do. It does not want to let go. But with forgiveness, you challenge that default mode network and you empower that central executive. All of the core religions have at their core some of these very common values. That's what I highlight in the book, not the politics, which I don't even touch.
In terms of the process of achieving inner peace, one involves breaking free from the prison of suffering, where a person has one foot nailed to the floor and they're just going round and around in circles. How can one set their feet upon the path of maintaining this peace long term, particularly in the face of recurring life stresses or traumas?
First of all, it took me 6 months. It was a difficult process. I describe it as walking through the desert. You're hungry, you're tired. You walk for the first month, you don't see anything. And you're like, why am I walking? But you walk and suddenly you see a desert rose. And you're like, wow, a few minutes of peace. You keep going. By the third and fourth month, you start to see water and an oasis emerge. It takes time. The most important thing is to set that intention and keep walking. The more fervently you set that intention, the more likely you are to get to that destination. A lot of us don't set that intention. We sit down to meditate. After a few minutes, all the thoughts are racing. We just give up. But you've got to set that intention and keep walking. It's like after a storm, Let's say there's a lake that is muddy and you look in the lake, you can't see through it, but you just keep looking. And after a few hours, a few days, the mud starts to settle, the clarity appears. And the mind is the same way. You've got to give it time, set that intention. When you set an intention, what you're using is your central executive. It's like a prayer. You come to the present moment with full honesty and acceptance. You say, this is my state. I wish to be at peace, and I will continue walking until I get it. And the more determination you have in setting that intention, the more likely it is you'll get to it. Setting an intention, very important, even in the hardest of times, set that intention.
I was thinking about this whole discovery, and I know there are many discoveries and ongoing discoveries about the brain, but the discovery of the default mode network is highlighted as a breakthrough. How does this discovery start to reshape our understanding of traditional psychological concepts like the ego? And what implications do you feel it has for future therapeutic practices?
It has massive implications. When I was in medical school 20 some years ago, the brain was thought of as all about hormones and neurotransmitters, and mental conditions were just an imbalance of neurotransmitters. So let's give this patient with depression a drug that will increase serotonin levels. And that was that. Well, for depression, SSRIs, these depression medicines, they'll improve symptoms by about 50% in 50% of patients. They don't cure the underlying issues. Medicine has recognized forms of therapy as being important, like cognitive behavioral therapy. But now with this default mode network, we now have a biomarker that allows us to image patients with depression and realize, look at this overactive default mode network. That biomarker is very important because it's tangible. It's an objective marker. And now we can start to test different types of treatment, including new therapies. The Native Americans have known for thousands of years that plant medicines help patients suffering from addiction. Why is that? Now we understand that it's through the default mode network. Naturally occurring mushrooms and cactus, some of them, these plant medicines, shut off the default mode network. I see in the future newer generations of these coming out that more effectively shut off the default mode without all of the side effects. I think we're going to start to see an embrace of Eastern medicine, particularly mindfulness and different forms of mindfulness. Buddhist monks, for example, have reduced connectivity in their default mode network. We can actually see it on an fMRI. It's just the beginning, and it reminds me of oncology 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we sequenced the genome, and that was the beginning. 20 years later, look at all of these medicines we're now developing for cancer. That's how I feel about the brain. It starts with an understanding, and the therapies come a decade or two later. If you're a young person and you're looking for a hot field, think about neuroscience. I think it's just the beginning.
About 30 years ago, when I was an exercise physiologist, I had a gentleman come to see me who was a monk. I remember taking his blood pressure. We were having a discussion, and he said to me, I can lower my blood pressure and my heart rate at will. 30 years ago, that was, what? How do you do that? I had the blood pressure unit connected to him. And by gosh, right there and then, I saw the numbers coming down. He was able to do that. I took his pulse, his regular resting heart rate, and then he said, okay, now take it again. He went into this very quiet, meditative posture, and I measured his heart rate. He got his heart rate down to 56 beats per minute. That was incredible because he was showing me something about the brain, showing me we have the technology, but we need to have access. We need to know how to use it. This is why I'm saying your book is a manual. It's not about being on remote where they're triggered because they don't have the practical toolkit of understanding.
Yes, exactly.
So that was a path to the higher self. That gave me an awakened awareness.
Yeah, that's amazing. And now I'm seeing scientific studies being published, clinical studies showing the health benefits of mindfulness, how it can reduce your blood pressure and heart rate. These are clinical studies, controlled studies showing an improvement in physical symptoms from disease, improvement in recovery associated with mindfulness practice or spiritual practice. It all makes sense when you realize the physiology here. When you're in that observing mind, which is essentially what you're doing in mindfulness. Sounds a lot easier than it is. It takes practice. But when you're in that observing mind, it is a place of peace. And this default mode network, which brings all of this glutamate and sympathetic activity, when you learn to observe it, you get to the natural resting state of the brain. When you're in that state, your blood pressure tends to lower, your heart rate tends to lower, and it's a much more peaceful place to be. That is the purpose of mindfulness practice. So now to see these studies being published is amazing. And by the way, the studies are now showing that those core values mentioned in spiritual practice, like forgiveness and empathy, those qualities are associated with better health. So that's how tangibly I'm seeing the science, the medicine, and the spirituality coming together in these clinical studies demonstrating the health benefits of spirituality, which I couldn't imagine 20 years ago.
With modern understanding about these things, from my experience when I was mentoring a client who had excessive weight, she was on this revolving door. The weight loss path, which we know is $1 billion industry, but the recidivism rate is 95%.
That's right.
And it wasn't weight loss she needed, it was weight release. But what she kept telling herself was, I need to lose. And of course, the brain is not wired necessarily for happiness, it's wired for survival. So it saw loss as, no, you're not going to go down that road. There was trauma in her childhood which had not been forgiven. But when forgiveness was exercised to oneself and then to others, the weight started to drop off a few months later. All that armoring was not about trying to lose weight through a diet or exercise. Yes, there are those things, but she was with that ball of string with knots in it, where she was undoing one knot and then finding another one, then finding another one. Didn't want to give up and saying, what the hell? This is not working. I've tried all these diets, and she'd spent thousands of dollars trying to lose weight. But when we drilled down, we got a deeper penetration and looked under the hood. This is about forgiveness.
Unfortunately, for the vast majority of people, the weight loss exercises and medications don't work in the long term. The weight comes back. And why is it? It's because many of us overeat, as you said, to deal with our emotional pain, or because of our addictive craving. These other knots that the default mode network has created for us. This is why I've put the lifestyle portion at the end of the book, because you can lose the weight and keep the weight off much more easily after you've resolved these knots and really gotten at the core of your emotional trauma, resolved it, and lost that cause of your overeating. The diet gurus, they're very happy for their customers to come back a year or 2 years later. They're very happy with that. But I think if you want to lose weight, get at the core issues that are driving the overeating. Once you do, losing weight will be natural and nearly effortless.
Today, enlightenment is seen as the awakening of spiritual consciousness, which leads to inner peace, compassion, and a deep sense of interconnectedness with life. It's transcending the ego and embracing virtues like patience, forgiveness, and humility, and self-awareness. The journey, as I've seen with clients, begins with honest self-reflection and recognizing how the 11 knots of the DMN manifest in your life. Because when we come to understand these knots, that's crucial to overcoming them and moving towards that parasympathetic state. And there are challenges in any kind of progression because it's not an easy path. It requires persistence, and initial progress can be slow, but that walk through the desert with dedication and those moments of serenity starts to appear. In terms of self-awareness and the ego, how does the development of the ego influence our perceptions and relationships with others?
Yeah. When the default mode network is in control, it's trying to ensure your survival. It believes falsely that for you to succeed, others have to fail and that you have to beat others. So life becomes a game of musical chairs where you're constantly comparing yourself to others, and breeds jealousy, breeds pride, because thousands of years ago, there was a high rate of infant mortality or childhood mortality. The children who made it were the ones who were demanding, right, selfishly demanding their food over the others. That's how life was for most of humanity. And so that default mode, the ingrained belief is that life revolves around me and I. It's a belief system around me and I. Anything that helps me, good. It's a good thing. It's a good force, a good person. Anything that doesn't help me, it's a bad force, right? That in our political leaders, that type of thinking. And so I know many of my colleagues are stuck in that default mode network. They don't realize there is this enlightened state. They ridicule it, actually. They're like, why would I leave the comforts of my cave, my default mode? What's the whole point? Because the default mode wants to keep control. It doesn't want to let go. But it turns out, and I can tell you from my experience, and I'm sure from your experience, that when you let go of that default mode, it's like the allegory of the cave. Once you leave the comforts of that cave, initially it's very difficult. The sun is shining bright in your eyes, but you keep walking and you open your eyes and you realize, wow, the world is so beautiful when I let go of this me and I, this self-obsession. It's a much more beautiful place, much more peaceful place. Learning to let go, that's the hardest part.
When you go back to tell the others in the cave, their default mode network is still kicking in because they cannot believe you. They still want to hang on to those shadowy puppets that they think is reality. Can you outline the consequences and implications of living primarily in the default mode network?
It's the survival part of our brain, and it wants life to happen a certain way. It will wander off to the past, wander to the future, building that narrative of me and I, the ego. It wants life to happen a certain way, which is impossible. Life is impermanent. It wants to be better than others. By forcing us to ensure our survival, it takes us down this lonely road where we feel dissatisfaction anytime life doesn't happen the way we want. Loneliness when we try to beat others, and this sort of selfishness, and of course, negativity, which is what it's wired to do. It has negativity bias. And all of those take us down this very lonely road where we feel in order to be happy, we need to make a lot of money, which is another hallmark of the default mode. Then we fall into addiction where we feel like to find fulfillment and meaning, we need to make more money and make more money. And that doesn't bring fulfillment, traps us in addiction. So when you learn to let go of the default mode and realize me and I is an illusion, it's insignificant. In the grand scheme of things, you and I as individuals are insignificant, which the default mode network finds very painful to believe. But once you embrace compassion, equanimity, and a sense of awe for the universe, just getting a taste of that, you don't want to go back to default mode. I never want to go back to that place because just being present, just simply existing is so glorious that you don't want to go back. For a lot of people, it takes hitting rock bottom or a period of intense suffering to want to be free of the default mode. That's why people who are in addiction or really suffering are the ones who are actually closest to entering that spiritual state. In a way, they're actually fortunate. They may not realize it. But if you're in a period of hardship, if you've been diagnosed with a disease or you've gotten into an accident, consider this an opportunity to connect with that spirituality. Maybe this is a real blessing for you to just consider.
What are some effective practices to shift from the default mode network to the central executive network?
If you are someone who is maybe independent, if you've tried mindfulness, that's very effective. Things like concentration meditation, insight meditation. If, however, you've never found good success there, consider working with a therapist. Cognitive behavioral therapy, there are many forms of therapy, radical acceptance, dialectical behavior therapy. You're essentially working with a therapist who is helping you recognize your default mode and maybe your anxiety. If you have an anxiety disorder, helping you really see the truth of reality. But if you want something very practical, breathing exercises where you spend 5 minutes, there's 4-7-8 breathing, box breathing. Those are all designed to reverse the stress response and to quiet that default mode. And also focus exercises where you spend 5 minutes focusing, really tuning into your senses, really effective. And there's countless other practices. Prayer, very effective. It's very effective for me because it brings you into the present with full acceptance and honesty, and you see the reality of your condition. You've just turned on the central executive when you pray. It turns out prayer is mindfulness, and for some people, very effective. Many different tools in this book.
How does the modern concept of enlightenment differ from traditional or historical understandings?
Buddha talked about the enlightened state, the state of nirvana. I see it exactly the same as that. Some people think that enlightenment is this amazing experience where you see lights and it's like a transcendent experience, which maybe it is for some people. We're all very different. When you say the word enlightenment, it's really looking inside of you. And what do you see when you look inside? I can't look inside for you, only you can. When you look inside, do you see light or darkness? It's that simple. If it's darkness, then the process of enlightenment is replacing that darkness with light by learning to recognize your cravings, your judgments, your negativity, all of which come from that default mode network. For me, it's a slow process. It's gradual. It takes time. It was not a sudden, I wake up and this transcendent experience. But one day, about 6 months in, I looked inside and I said, wow, I feel different. My baseline state is happy and peaceful, which wasn't the case 6 months earlier. I realized I have entered what has been called an enlightened state. I don't think we should ever call ourselves enlightened. I think that's a trap. It's a journey that continues throughout life. That process of awakening is, for me, very slow and steady, but worth it, worth every step, because the peace you finally experience is just so tranquil and worth the journey.
Totally agree. In terms of the knots, 11 knots you mentioned in your book, can you outline for the audience how some of these knots, maybe one or two, how they manifest in one's life?
And they're all interrelated. I mentioned emotional pain and addiction, which I call addictive craving, intertwined. If you don't address one, it's hard to address the other. For example, dishonesty and denial is one towards the end of the book. It's a barrier for many people, especially the denial. You've got to look inside with full honesty and acceptance if you want to make real progress. So that's intertwined with all the others. So dishonesty, denial, and anxiety are intertwined. We may not believe so, but for many of us are in denial of our current mental state. And we're in this paradox where we hope that life will get better and we believe that life will get better, but it doesn't. And we don't really accept the reality of the situation. We're almost deluding ourselves. And so they're all interrelated. So this is a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes time, but chipping away at your knots. I have the analogy of Michelangelo chipping away at the marble block to find the sculpture that was already within, right? That's the way he described it. He's freeing this statue that's inside. In many ways, you're chipping away at your mental knots to get at the inner peace that is already there. That central executive is already there. It's a matter of building it, which takes intention and practice.
Let's talk about understanding the science of stress. What is the primary purpose of stress?
Yes, we need stress to make it through the day. We may have at any given moment an earthquake, car accident, any number of situations. Life is unpredictable. We need our bodies to be able to react instantly by pumping our heart rate, blood pressure, getting our senses ready to flee, to attack. And that's the sympathetic response. In the old days, life was hard. We maybe needed our stress response constantly throughout the day. Nowadays, we may not need that stress response, but our thoughts tend to trigger them, particularly that default mode. We may be driving down the street and seeing somebody at the street corner, and our judgmental negativity triggers the stress response. Just a thought or a fleeting glance. And that stress response, those hormones that are released, are hurting your body. They're literally shifting energy away from your immune system, away from your reproductive system, towards the brain, causing some major damage. Coming to realize that this stress response, how it's impacting you, may make you motivated to stop the thoughts that are triggering the stress. Social media is also designed to give us stress.
You move from the fight or flight mechanism to chronic stress. Is that how the body's stress response can evolve?
That's right. For many people, chronic stress can, and many studies have shown this, that chronic stress can unfortunately lead to some debilitating physical illnesses. When you look at the physiology, it makes sense. The stress hormones wreak havoc on the body. We were not meant to live in a state of constant stress. That's not how our bodies were designed. But it turns out your body has naturally occurring signals to reduce that stress. One of them is GABA. Chapter 1, that first knot, is about getting the GABA, the parasympathetic, the vagal response throughout the day, learning to cultivate it, and it will naturally prevent stress from happening. So there are exercises there that are designed to lower your stress level. And once you lower your stress level, it becomes easier to deal with the other mental knots.
I call that the brake pedal.
Yes.
What I hear people talking a lot about is cortisol. Many people don't understand the role of cortisol. What role does cortisol play in the body's stress response? And how does it affect different systems?
Yes. So cortisol is one of the stress hormones. It's not immediately acting the way adrenaline and noradrenaline are. Cortisol is almost like a second wave. And what it's designed to do is to shift energy away from non-essential systems in the body, which actually I consider pretty essential. So the immune system, right? Cortisol will shift energy away from the immune system. And that's why, for example, if you're having a severe immune reaction, what do you get? You get corticosteroids. That cortisol lowers your immune system, reproductive system, but in doing so, in the long term, makes you susceptible to things like cancer. And so cortisol was, in the old days, it allowed us to survive very difficult circumstances, famine, for example. We were able to lower our energy needs, but we weren't designed for cortisol to be on all the time, which unfortunately frequent smartphone usage and technology can get the cortisol flowing, and it's pretty dangerous, actually.
In a tense situation, if you are within a proximal distance with someone you're in conflict, does cortisol leak into their system? I remember hearing, I can't remember what podcast it was on, but I think it was a neuroscientist who thought cortisol remained within the body, but it actually can leak out of the body and transfer to someone else in a conflict type situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm not aware of that, but I'll take a look at that. I don't know the details of that in particular, but certainly when you're in that stressful negative state, it's contagious. When you're stuck in that reactive judgmental way of living and you see somebody who is angry, you're more likely to get angry because your default mode kicks in, versus when you're in that observing mind and you see somebody who's angry, you can observe them, doesn't affect you. And that's another advantage of living in that observing mind is people don't bother you as much. You observe them, you see your feelings and emotions come and go. It doesn't trigger the stress response. Whether that's purely mental or hormonal, I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly mental.
I was talking to a returning guest yesterday. I gave her a visual of a triangle. At the top, you have neutral. On the base or either end, you have positive and negative. If you are in that positive and negative dynamic where you have conflict or you have tension, that tends to create an internal pressure, and that internal pressure is going to go somewhere or do something. But if you're in an observer mode at the neutral vector, you can see both sides of things.
That's right. Exactly. Many of us have bosses, let's say in the corporate world, who give us a lot of pressure, and they're in that negative triangle. And it can be very challenging when you're trying to be mindful and enlightened, let's say, when your boss is an asshole and giving you pressure all the time. But I would go back to the core values, exercise your patience, your equanimity, because that's the way to overcome that angry negative triangle, by upholding those qualities of the observer and just continue at it. Patience is the ultimate enemy of that angry judgmental state.
How does the modern interpretation of stress differ from the stress experienced by our ancestors?
The physical manifestation is the same, right? The end consequence of all of the adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol. It's just what is triggering the stress response is very different. Before, the reality of our past and how difficult life was naturally triggered stress. These days, it's more our own thoughts, internal mental chatter, and what we see on TV or on our phones. But the end result is the same. So I think coming to recognize what triggers stress for you and setting that intention of maybe removing or lowering some of these sources of stress can change your life. So I think really objectively looking at it, just as you objectively look at your default mode, and figure out ways to prevent this stress from happening as best as you can, remove some of the sources or deal with them a bit differently.
How can an overactive default mode network contribute to distress?
Some of us have, let's say, a default mode network that wanders off to the past, maybe to childhood, maybe to a childhood trauma. So every time the wandering mind revisits that trauma, it brings out these painful memories and emotions, and those emotions can trigger the stress response. So many of us live in a constant state of stress that's given rise by this wandering mind that is constantly going back to the past, or it's constantly thinking about the future. That anxiety it generates gives us the stress response. And many of us, again, we're living in a constant state of stress. When you come to realize and recognize this default mode network is not who you are, you can silence it and heal it. You can break the connection between that memory and the emotion. You can sever that link so that anytime that memory comes up, it doesn't trigger those emotions. It doesn't trigger the stress response. You mentioned forgiveness, very powerful technique that effectively does that, but different forms of therapy can also do the same thing.
Are you okay for a few more minutes?
I need to catch a flight, but
okay.
What we can do, I'm working on the next book, which is about the Salience Network. It's related to this, but maybe we can continue the discussion and talk about the Salience Network. I'm still learning about it, but that make for a really good conversation.
Look, it's been a great pleasure. And there's so much more I want to talk to you about because I've got so many questions. But thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your insights. I really do appreciate your time. And thank you so much for the book. If people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Very simple. It's yourdefaultmode.com, one word. And the book is there. You can start reading it for free. My social media handles are at the bottom of that page. Thank you for having me on. It's just been wonderful.
You're most welcome. Thank you, Hossein.
Thank you, Peter.